Joining us for this last discussion session will be our presenters from today, Catherine Oliver and Joe Lane. Both are in different locations in the UK, so this is turning into a late evening event for both of them, and we appreciate them staying with us for as long as they can. We will also be hearing from some reactors, fellow NIDILRR grantees. John Stone, Director of the Center for International Rehabilitation Research, Information and Exchange Theory, and Dr. Sarah von Schroeder, Assistant Director of Research at the Yang Tan Employment and Disability Institute at Cornell University, who will reflect on today's presentation. Then Josephine Wilson, Director of the Substance Abuse Resources and Disability Issues Program at Wright State University, and Anna Norweg, Research Assistant Professor at Northwestern University and the Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago, will give their thoughts on how the 3 days as a whole have offered some key points that we can build on in the future. My colleague Kathleen Murphy will facilitate the discussion, so I'll now hand the virtual microphone to her. Kathleen?
Hi, everyone. So I wanted to make it clear that we want this discussion to be as interactive as possible. Really, please post your questions and responses in the chat box. And if you didn't get a chance to ask your question to the presenter during the conference, well, this is your chance. Don't feel like it has to be a question. Feel free to comment or just put whatever thoughts you do have right there in that chat box to share with everyone else. We're going to sprinkle a few poll questions in too, so we can continue to learn more about each other. We have a couple of polls for each presenter, and I'm going to run the polls prior to each of the discussions, and then John, after these particular two, you can take it over, and John, you can comment on the poll results if you want or not, up to you. So Lauren, can you go ahead and put up the first poll? Okay, so we thought, given this afternoon's sessions, that some of you might have actually had experience sharing research evidence with policymakers. So we were wondering if any of you might have participated in a briefing or written an op-ed or sent out a research report, attended a face-to-face meeting, developed a product targeted to the policymaker audience. So it seems like most commonly people are developing products that they target for policymakers, and then perhaps they are setting up meetings to introduce those products, sending out a research report, but least often are they engaging in writing an op-ed. We didn't ask, and perhaps people are getting involved in less formal ways of outreach than an op-ed, like having a blog or something like that, something on social media. Okay, so interesting feedback. Lauren, could you put up the second question and give our discussants a little sense of the experiences of those in the room? So this one talks about what kind of policy context might be most relevant to the work of the people in the room. We are really happy that we get quite an international audience for our conferences, so we thought perhaps that in addition to the U.S. domestic or state or local, we certainly know we have great interaction with our friends in Canada, so there's domestic and provincial local Canadian politics, and then some of these issues are international. I know our own centers are very involved in the Campbell and Cochrane collaborations, for example, organizations that produce systematic reviews and attract an international group of volunteer scholars. And we know our own Joe Lane is right there at an international conference, and we have people, Catherine Oliver, online from England. So it looks though like yes, we have a great representation from Canada. A third of you are engaged in provincial or local politics in Canada. And then we're just about evenly split on the U.S. side of the border between domestic, state, and local. Great. So that, I think, John and Sarah and everyone else on the line will give you a little bit of sense of who's listening. So, John, are you ready to come online and tell us what you thought about?
Yes, I am.
Great.
It was very gratifying to see so much international participation in this event. We have learned over the years that we get quite a bit of new insights by sharing ideas and expertise with people from other countries. I think all of us would like to thank our presenter, Dr. Oliver, for her presentation on the fascinating subject of barriers to and facilitators of the use of evidence by policymakers. I did read her article, The Systematic Review of Barriers to and Facilitators of the Use of Evidence by Policymakers, and I was very impressed by the number of studies that she and her team were able to include in the systematic review, but also the ability of the team to get arms around such a large set of studies that really vary so much in methodologies, subject areas, and context, and in the end to come up with a set of conclusions that are insightful across a broad context. I have a few questions and reflections on the material that Dr. Oliver presented, and I'd like to direct those primarily to her, but also invite, as Kathleen said, for the audience to, the rest of the audience to reflect upon my reflections or questions as they see fit. The first question is related to this term policymakers. The question is basically, what does that term mean? Who are included? Who are the policymakers? And I've tended to think primarily of government policymakers or persons within government agencies at different levels that make decisions related to the allocation of resources. But as I thought about it more, we do hear the term company policy, which means that the private sector also has policymakers. We also are aware of non-governmental organizations that have their own policies. So I guess the question is, when we talk about policymakers in the context that we're talking about today, are we talking exclusively about public policy, or are we also thinking secondarily, at least, about these other types of policymakers? And within the systematic review, did that include some examples of non-governmental policymaking, or was it focused exclusively on the public sector?
Shall I respond to that now?
If Dr. Oliver would like to comment on that, I will then go on to further questions and comments.
Is this going through? Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. I've just lost connection on the internet, so I'm not connected. So I think that's a really interesting question. What do we mean by policymakers? And when we did the review, we only included studies which looked at policies that affected more than one organization. So the reason we did that is because there's so many studies that look at hospitals, basically, and looking at policies specifically within a hospital. So we might have excluded some company policymakers, but we tried to be as exhaustive and inclusive as possible. We wanted to know how decisions are made, really, rather than, not just political decisions, but how evidence is used in all forms of decision making. In general, I'd say that probably somewhere in the region of 90 to 95% of the studies we found did not say who the policymakers were. They just called them policymakers. And that makes it very difficult to know how the process works in different contexts.
Okay, thank you. Another issue that was very much highlighted in your presentation and also in your article was the relationships and collaborations between researchers and policymakers. The fact of that the nature of their interactions. And you did identify characteristics of researchers that are facilitators or barriers. On the facilitating side, you identified good understanding of the policy process on the part of researchers as being very helpful in communicating with them and facilitating their use of evidence. And on the flip side, you identified that there's a disconnect sometimes between academic versus policy priorities, that the academics place a great deal of emphasis on publishable research, whereas the policymakers may be less interested, although they do want valid, reliable information or evidence, they are perhaps a bit less concerned with that factor as they are with the timeliness and relevance of the evidence that's provided to them. And that it appears to me that we may have a disconnect in the sense that researchers who are not part of the policymaking process typically do not perform research that's on the specific issue that a policymaker may be currently addressing. So the question of the selection of the topic for the research and the timing of presenting the findings may be one of the problems in this communication process. I showed one slide on the gap between the stereotypical researcher versus the stereotypical policymakers, and suggested that there might be some hybrids that could be useful. And that raised a question in my mind about distinguishing between studies commissioned by the policymakers versus studies that are conducted with financing that are outside the agencies themselves. So a researcher will do his research, and then when the researcher has the results, will then go to the policymaker and say, hey, see what I found. We think you might be able to use it. Versus contexts where the policymaker says, gee, I have to make a decision, and I have all the evidence that I would like to have to make a decision among priorities, and therefore I'm going to go out and find a researcher who can conduct a study that will help me to make the decision. And I was wondering, again, if the systematic review included that kind of study, or whether it was conducted mainly with research that was published in journals. And also another type of condition that sometimes exists related to research and policy is in-house research versus external research. So, for example, there are some research hospitals that have their own research arm, and they interact with the clinicians on a regular basis because they're housed in the same organization, and that tends to generate research that the clinicians themselves are already interested in, rather than finding something and then going and trying to interest the policymaker. So again, kind of different situations were they recognized within the systematic review, or was it typically of one type or the other?
Wow, I'll do my best to answer all those questions. So the question of whether or not there's a difference between in-house research, commission research, and external research, and how whether they're used differently by policymakers is a really interesting one. And most of the studies which we found looked primarily at research that was just publicly funded through grants, and was conducted by academics out of a sort of research interest of theirs, and then was disseminated. So kind of like normal traditional academic research. There were a couple of studies. I'm trying to bring their names to mind. I'm trying to look them up now, actually, which did look at specific, research which had been specifically commissioned for a purpose. So there was one, an economic evaluation, and a study of economic evaluations, and that was very interesting. If I find it, I'll post a link to it. But my internet's now being really slow. But in general, no one tried to make a comparison between the different types of research. For me, that's a really open question as to how that works. But I think it does raise some really interesting issues about who gets to own the question and who gets to decide what research is done. I think, in a way, it relates to a point that the previous speaker, Joe, was trying to make, was making very effectively, about whose expertise is kind of heard and throughout the process. So, oh no.
Okay, I think Catherine's having a little trouble with her line, so we will hope that she can join us soon. John, did you have any immediate reactions to where she was going?
No, I thought she understood and interpreted well my rather rambling question. That there are different situations, the internal and commissioned research that we would think would tend to be much more relevant to the policymaker because they themselves have requested it, versus research that comes to them from the outside, which might at this particular period of time not be high on their priority list. And I believe she said she did include some of both kinds of research, but we kind of lost her at the end of her comments there.
Sure.
Hi, I'm back now, sorry.
Oh, yay.
Great.
A bit of a tech fail. I was making a point, but I can't remember what it was now. Can anyone remind me what I was talking about?
Internal and commissioned research versus externally funded research, and would one tend to be more relevant to the policymaker than the other?
Oh, yes, that's right. So the reason I mentioned the previous talk was because I thought one of the possible misconceptions that I think academics tend to make about the policymakers is that they need an answer through a new study. And I think sometimes it's really easy to underestimate the value of our expertise without having to go out and do a new piece of work. And I think sometimes policymakers don't need a new study. They need, what they need is a conversation with someone who knows the area perhaps better than we realize ourselves. I think this relates to, new research not being the same as new, so the process not being the same. It doesn't have to be something new all the time. It can be using knowledge that we have already generated.
Okay, a final question or observation relates to a distinction between research and evidence. I'm wondering, not all evidence is research evidence, is where I'm coming from. And I'm wondering if maybe program evaluation might be closer to policymaking than is research in some contexts. Of course, those kinds of studies are not always publishable, so they don't have a wider audience. But if they are directed to a specific policymaker within a particular or within a particular agency, they may be sometimes more valued than research per se. And I don't know, the distinction between research and evaluation is not always a clear one, of course. But I guess the point is, a study or an analysis that may not be publishable as a research article might, on some occasions, be more immediately useful to some policymakers in some instances. I don't know if you know what your feeling is about that.
Well, I completely agree with you. I think one of the reasons I keep banging on about having to try and understand the policymakers' needs, information needs, is precisely that sort of question. I think if you do spend, all of us who have spent time talking to policymakers, hear about things like that all the time, and knowing how to utilize things like surveillance data, or crime statistics, or population changes and flows, changes in demographics. These are all incredibly useful for policymakers at national and local levels, and in many cases much more useful because you can analyze them in a way that sort of suits you rather than having to address an a priori research question. And I think this kind of thing is really off the radar of a lot of academics who are interested in research utilization, because we tend to automatically assume that evidence means research evidence, and of course it doesn't. I've had some interesting conversations about this recently with some colleagues in science and technology studies who come at it from completely the other end of the spectrum. So their conception of evidence is any kind of knowledge used at all. So if you approach it from that end, you start thinking about things like tacit knowledge between individual policymakers, relationships going back maybe 20, 30, 40 years, and what that does, what that changes, how that changes the discussion in the room. You start thinking about things like public pressure, about the way that media reports different political issues and how that plays into the process. And I think using that kind of lens to understand how research evidence is just one voice in the room is actually really helpful when we're trying to think about how to make that voice a bit louder.
Okay, that pretty much is the main thrust of my questions and comments. I guess we have we may have some from the coming up from the audience.
Yes, actually, and I think both of you would have perhaps something to say to this. From an international KT and policy perspective, what are some of the specific barriers that are unique to or similar between the U.S., Canada, the U.K., or I know, John, your center serves the world. So do you have any thoughts about how policy environments differ in different national contexts?
Well, if we're only talking about U.S., Canada, and U.K., I would guess that the difference among them would be far less than the difference between them and developing countries or less resource countries, where and this was noted in Catherine's article, Systematic Review, that there were a few studies from developing countries, and I believe she noted that things were quite different there in terms of KT. Perhaps she could comment on the differences that she found in
Sure.
the reported article.
Sorry, John, did you have any more to say?
No, go ahead.
So we found quite a few studies in what we call developing countries, and they tended to be associated with, so they were written by people who have a connection with EVIPNet by and large, so with John Lavis's group, and he's been supporting lots of sort of evidence use initiatives around the world. And the differences really seem to be obviously one of resource. So, in the UK, we have NICE, we have we have the Campbell, we have Cochrane, and we have massive infrastructure supporting the production of useful evidence, and it's the same in different ways in the US and Canada. And in somewhere like Nigeria, they just don't have that. What they have is one person, she's called Rona, and she works in the Ministry of Health, and she does a rapid evidence, she runs a rapid response unit, and it's basically just her. She does systematic reviews in about 4 weeks and then informs the Minister of Health various different issues. So that's one issue. The other one is the context that they're dealing with is wildly different. So I had quite a nice conversation with her. I happened to meet her at a conference once. And, I was saying one of the big things we're talking about right now is e-cigarettes and that kind of thing. And she said that one of the big issues that they were trying to wrestle with was how do you police a border which is in the middle of a jungle, which, people cross it all the time, and they have headaches, and sometimes it's malaria and sometimes it's Ebola. And how do you know what to do in that situation? How are you possibly supposed to find evidence to help, border guards make those decisions, or make the Ministry of Health make those decisions? And there just isn't any. So, wildly different priorities, research priorities and policy priorities, and very different research needs. But they tend to be using models that were developed by, by McMaster, or in the UK or in the US. So I'm not sure how much evidence there is about how well the models, knowledge translation models, work in different situations. But it's definitely a growing field.
That's really interesting, Catherine. It also raises the factor of the urgency. Obviously, if we're talking about Ebola, we're not going to wait for a systematic review. We're going to go with the best available information or evidence and get that right to people on the front line.
Yeah.
John, did you have any final comments before we turn to a couple of poll questions and then Dr. Schrader's comments?
No, I don't have more. I see in the chat section a comment about DECIDE,
Mm-hmm.
which I'm not familiar with, to be honest.
No, I'm actually not either. So that's why Dr. Santaguida, if you could elaborate a bit on what DECIDE stands for, because if someone were to Google that, it's obviously not necessarily going to pull up that group. So it's a very common word. Or we'll look into it ourselves and get it out to the conference participants. Okay, so we wanted to turn then to get some reaction to Jo Lane's presentation, Linguistic and Conceptual Barriers that Hamper Effective Communication with Policymakers and Implementers. And we do have Sarah Von Schrader on the line to react. And we were going to do a couple of poll questions, again, just to sort of kind of break it up, give a sense of who's in the room and their maybe familiarity or prior familiarity with some of what Jo Lane was talking about. So he mentioned in his presentation the book by Stephen Levitt and Stephen Dubnar, Freakonomics. Stephen Levitt's a University of Chicago economist, and Stephen Dubnar is a New York Times journalist. And Jo had talked about personal incentives as far as thinking about relevance and unintended consequences, which has some nice links to the network analysis that Catherine Oliver presented in her presentation. So no, I guess most of you have not, and I'll bet if we were to do this poll again next year, that results would be different. So yeah, Lauren, if you could go ahead and pull up the second poll question. And again, this is a question based on Joe's presentation where he had 4 levels of new knowledge engagement. So for those who are participating, maybe you don't have direct experience with policymakers, but pretty much everybody, particularly in the U.S. now, is observing policymakers or thinking through those, who do we want to be our policymaker at the presidential level, given that we're in this season. So we think that there is some interest on the level of policymakers, that they retain some information and intend to explore it, or they're kind of aware but indifferent. And we're certainly, nobody thinks we're at that either level of use, whether it be active implementation or a direct adoption or even an adaptation. So we've got some work to go there as a field of people who are interested and want to forward the cause of knowledge translation. Sarah, I don't know if that is helpful to you, if you want to speak to that. Are you live?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
That was really helpful, actually.
Mm-hmm.
One who has not read Freakonomics, but I actually, after looking at the slides, I went down to The Economist, who has his door next to me, and talked to him a little bit about Freakonomics. So I got a little bit of the Cliff Notes version. It was very interesting. Now I would like to read it as well. And then the other question I also thought was interesting, kind of also thinking about that in relation to what Catherine presented earlier today, if I'm remembering it well, sort of all the different sources of evidence that are not necessarily research that policymakers are using, often relying on expert opinion and who those experts are. So I think that's really
Sarah, everyone, excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt, but people are asking if you could speak up a bit because we really want to hear what you say.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay.
I tend to be a little bit quiet, so I will.
Me too, so we got to have pity on all the people in the audience here. Okay. Okay, we'll both speak up. Here you go.
Great, and please let me know again. Please feel free to interrupt me if I'm getting quiet again. So I really enjoyed both of the presentations today. Particularly, I focused on Joe's presentation because that's what I was discussing, and for me it was really interesting because I'm really from more of a research focus, and I'm not sort of in the development area, and so some of the topics that he and sort of the way he was talking about things were a little bit new for me, and I found it really, really interesting. And I think the thing that throughout this conference, but particularly what the beginning and the ending of Joe's talk really focused on relevance, and I think that's really central to everything that we're doing, and I liked the big emphasis on that. There were a few things that really stuck out to me, really the statement that doing your homework prior to the grant is the only way you can really ensure that relevance. And really understanding, I think he said, the interests and motives and incentives of the target audience. And I think those are really powerful words and things that we should all be thinking about. One of the things is I'm thinking about relevance, and often we approach issues and problems from a single disciplinary perspective. And so I often think that thinking about things as problems or issues and thinking about it from a multidisciplinary perspective can create more relevant work, but it really all starts with really understanding what the questions are from our ultimate knowledge users. So that was one of the things. I think that I was interested in. One of the things that came up, I like examples of things as I'm thinking about this, because it's really a big task to think about before developing a project. Who are all the different possible knowledge users? And you probably can't really include all of them, but how do you go about developing the information that you need to really create a project that'll be relevant? And relevant, you know, research doesn't happen overnight. Kind of thinking about what are sort of these emerging and new issues, what are people going to need, you know, a year from now, when you're probably going to be able to get through a real research study, if not longer. So I was interested in that, and also from the development perspective, thinking about ways that we can sort of do that pre-planning. And I know Strategizer was something that was sort of a tool that was mentioned. I thought that was very interesting, and I was wondering if there were any other approaches or resources that you might suggest, Joe, around that in sort of doing that pre-work.
Hi, yes. Well, thanks for the comments and the questions. We have actually created this need-to-knowledge model where one of the issues and one of the reasons we're funded is the Center on Knowledge Translation for Technology Transfer is typically this kind of customer market analysis, technical review happens within a company, within a corporation, you know, routinely, especially when they're looking at doing technology and product development. They know what they need to know, and they have the people in-house who can do that level of work. What we have here with what's transpired in the past 50, 70 years of allocating money for these kind of hybrid programs, I have some interesting data that shows that There's always been a stream of money for basic research, and there's always been a stream of money for contract procurement to meet national needs for like defense and energy and so on. And there's always been this basket of money for these sort of hybrid R&D programs. And where that basket, probably 80-20 distribution, 80% went to industry, 20% went to universities, say in the 1960s, it's reversed. It's about 80-20 the other way. So what we have is a system where we're intending social and economic benefit, which is typically provided through the market forces of the private sector, but we're handing that responsibility over to an academic sector that is not trained in the methods, nor do they know what they don't know and need to know in order to implement the methods. So we created this need to knowledge model, which is a stage gate framework, where we laid out the activities required to initiate research, both a general exploratory work and then the specific analysis required by the project, then sort of a draft business case before proceeding into engineering development, and then the decision whether to pass that on to industry. And it's 9 stages and 9 gates, because it's as important to consider the decision whether to continue as it is to initiate the project in the first place. And we've populated that model with hundreds of excerpts from literature that provides an evidence base for the stages, the gates, the steps within the stages. We've populated it with a number of examples, case examples drawn from past transfer commercialization experience. And then as people started using the model, we found that many people, many funded researchers were saying, hey, you have this call to do technical analysis or marketing analysis or consumer analysis, customer analysis, and we don't know what you're talking about. So we actually had a project to add nearly 80 examples of analytic tools that can be used in the various stages and steps. And so if someone were to look at the need to knowledge model in the table version, you'd see the basic stages and steps. You'd see little magnifying glasses, and you click on that magnifying glass icon. It takes you to the underlying supporting literature base. And you'll also see little red toolboxes. And any place there's a requirement for analysis, there's a little red toolbox. And the interesting thing is, of the 80 tools, 2/3 of them relate to business and marketing, because that's really where the uncertainty lies. And so they say, I have almost 80 examples of the types of tools one needs to know about in order to effectively conduct the research development and production components. And those are just a representative sample. So there's more than I could name, but fortunately there's at least 80 variations of analytic tools built into the model, if anyone's interested in looking at those.
That's great. I'm actually got this jotted down. I'm going to go take a look at that, because that is something, as we're thinking about developing products out of our research, I've been thinking about this a little bit lately. It's not a skill set that we necessarily have, and how to get that. So thank you for that resource. One other thing I wanted to ask you a little bit about, I read in some detail a couple of your articles that you cited that I thought were really, really interesting. Sort of looking at the studies where you were sort of looking at the difference between diffusion and dissemination and translation. And I thought it was really interesting sort of that there wasn't actually a lot of difference between dissemination and where you did the more intensive translation of the research. And I was curious why you think that might have been. It seemed like in another article that you have where you were talking to organizations, about national organizations about their needs. They really highlighted the need for information for them to be translated, that they felt uncomfortable necessarily not translating an article into something that was more of a brief. But I was curious because those seem to be a little bit in conflict to me. But why perhaps there was not the difference between the movement, I'm not expressing myself very well, the movement to greater use of the information with the dissemination and the translation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. That's a really good point. Thanks for asking about it. RCTs that compared passive diffusion, active dissemination, and targeted translation, we involved the investigators who had conducted the original studies and published the work to make sure that what we were the artifact in our translated documents and our webcasts reflected accurately their findings. And that was a question, a criticism that had come up in a review of one of the manuscripts. Well, how do you know you translated it properly? We said, well, we did not. We worked with the investigator to do the translation. And so it may not be necessary to do the translation for the potential user to absorb the knowledge, but it is important to make sure if translation or even communication, whether it's translation or dissemination, if you're paraphrasing or trying to boil down the critical point for sharing it with, say, members of an organization, it's important that it's accurate. And that's what we found in that knowledge value mapping study where we surveyed national organizations. Because one of the issues with knowledge translation, I'm sure everyone on the call is aware, people said, oh great, another unfunded mandate. Where are we supposed to get the time, the money, and the energy to now stop working on our research and translate our findings into multiple formats, multiple levels, and do so for various stakeholder audiences? And even if we go to all that trouble, how the heck do we ever get it to the very people we're trying to target? Are we supposed to go door to door? Are we supposed to sit at different disciplines conferences? And I think they're all valid points. And what we were trying to determine, well, is there another way to share scholarly findings with various various non-traditional stakeholder groups? And so the notion of working with national organizations who represent stakeholders who may potentially put that information to use was that study's purpose. We wanted to survey national organizations that represented the different stakeholders around each of those three application areas, AAC, mobility, and recreation. And said, hey, what do you think of this? Would this be useful? Would because obviously, just like an academic journal, national organizations, especially professional bodies, are always looking for new information to share with their members. That's a value add. That's why people join the organization, or that's why they subscribe to the journal, is they're looking to receive something of value. And when we did our knowledge value mapping survey, which we developed with Juan Rogers, who obviously was one of the people who developed the notion of knowledge value mapping, it was a little bit surprising, but it was interesting to find that organizations were clearly very concerned about making sure they did not, excuse me, improperly or inaccurately represent the findings themselves. So as far as they were concerned, they were delighted in forging relationships with scholars who could represent expertise, that they could start developing a relationship. The scholars could then go back to them with future fundings. But they were very careful to say, but we do not want to interpret or translate their findings on our own. We very much want the scholar engaged to do that kind of translation or explanation themselves. So I guess that's the finer distinction here, is that maybe consumers or targeted stakeholders could discern the relative value themselves, but the producers and the intermediaries very much want to make sure that nothing's, quote, lost in translation, to borrow Ian Graham's famous title in the movie itself. So that's the distinction there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. That's really, really interesting. And anyway, I thought they were really great studies.
Thank you.
I think those are my main points. The other thing that you said that sort of stuck with me is the sort of overstating the findings of research with policymakers and really sort of setting those boundaries. And I suppose sometimes I think there's always this fear when you're translating, or when others perhaps are translating research you do, that they take it to a level that maybe it shouldn't be at, maybe taking a little bit further than really it should be generalized. And so I think that's sort of a related point, but I thought that was a very good point.
Sarah, could you speak up a little bit?
Yes, I apologize. So anyway, basically my point was just that the sort of the concern about overstating the findings of research and how being able having the researcher actually there to do that translation perhaps limits So,
Okay, great.
another point. That's it.
Perfect.
And it looks like there's a few questions over in the chat box. Oh, Joanne, were you going to go through those?
I think there's just been some kind of people kind of referencing things that you all have been talking about. So I don't know if we have necessarily a question that needs to be addressed right now. I think we'll hold those comments, and because we have 2 more people that have prepared comments, and we can bring in some of those questions as relevant to the rest of the half hour that we have together. Thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate it. Interesting, insightful observations.
Thank you.
Sure. So next, we're going to hear from a couple of people who are going to try to help us tie together all 3 days. And many, I guess we've had maybe 9 sessions or 8 or 9 sessions for this whole conference all week. So we'll hear first from the name on the bottom of your slide there, Anna Norweg, who is a research assistant professor at Northwestern University and the Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago. And she's going to try to wrap it up for us, or tie it all up in a bow. And then we'll hear from Joe Wilson. So Anna, are you ready? Anna? Joe, if you're here, we'll go ahead and let you go if Anna had to step away.
That's fine. I can wait.
Okay.
Wait to see. I'm happy to
okay.
start.
Anna, I know you were wanting to go first, so perhaps your phone is muted.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great, fantastic. And yes, I was muted.
Okay.
So I wanted to make a few comments. I feel that we've learnt many things each day that help us to identify barriers as well as solutions for overcoming these barriers in order to increase the use of research. And I'm just going to list some things, some of my takeaway messages, if you will. One of my take-home message was the importance of identifying stakeholder priorities for research in order to identify important research questions and focus. I think before this conference, I wasn't really sure about engaging with stakeholders. There was a prominent article in a peer-reviewed journal which was entitled Stakeholder Priorities for Comparative Effectiveness Research, and I wasn't really sure what to do with that kind of research publication. But from this conference, I've learned that engaging with stakeholders, that is potential research knowledge users, in the entire research process and including them as part of the research team, which we are referring to as integrated KT, is important for a number of reasons. And some of those reasons are in order to understand them and their needs and to speed up the time needed for knowledge translation and application in clinical practice. So in other words, engaging stakeholders is important to improve KT outcomes and efficiency. And I thought it was interesting to think about integrated KT, patient-centered outcomes as a form of integrated KT. Another take-home message for me was I thought it was invaluable to hear from people involved in KT research specifically and to learn from their examples and expertise. And I also found it helpful to access valuable KT resources and guidelines from this conference. And I also found some KT models presented very helpful. I found it very helpful. We had some really good examples of how to best translate research findings for use by various stakeholders. What else? I heard presenters consistently state not to be hindered by the level of evidence available. That is, stakeholders, patients, clinicians, policymakers, etc., are interested in the best available evidence to help support their decision making at the current present time. The term practical KT was used, so that was a fairly loud and clear message for me. And as a researcher, I too can feel a little bit overwhelmed by the insufficient high-level evidence sometimes as a hindrance, but the message I took was all evidence is valuable. I learned that there are challenges in measuring the impact of KT efforts, and some of those KT outcome, some of the KT outcome research highlighted in the conference, however, can help us guide us in advancing this area of needed research to measure KT outcomes. I also liked to hear about those fact sheets being generated by KT research and the knowledge translation packages that were mentioned. And I see those outputs as being very helpful to clinicians in practicing evidence-based therapy and patient-centered care. So I think clinicians can really serve as important brokers of KT, and I don't think I've conceptualized that prior to this conference. Now I just wanted to make a couple of comments about the presentations today because of course they're more fresh in our minds. I think Catherine Oliver did a great job today highlighting the barriers to involving policymakers as stakeholders in research. I think she gave some good examples for how to bridge that communication and collaboration between academics and policymakers. And she also raised, for me at least, some potential ethical issues that collaborations with policymakers can have for researchers. For example, the potential bias that can happen if policymakers are able to preview or review manuscripts before they're published. And then finally, I really enjoyed Joe Lane's presentation today. I think he pointed out an important challenge to KT, which is information overload in this digital age, and therefore the importance of communicating relevance of new knowledge to stakeholders so that new knowledge is not incorrectly screened out as noise. And I learned ways to communicate the value of new products and services by distinguishing between the terms discovery, invention, and innovation. So I thank everybody very much for the presentations and knowledge gained from this conference.
Great. Well, those are really great themes that you were picked up on, Anna. And I know some people here in the chat also, like you, appreciated some of the really concrete ways that were discussed as far as thinking about ways of outreach or, as Just Taken put it, KT in Action. And Susan Lynch has offered us a resource, the Frameworks Institute, that's engaged in some of these kinds of efforts. Unless, Anna, you had any other final thoughts, we'll turn to Jo Wilson. Anna, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, I think that was it. Thanks.
Okay. So I know Jo Wilson is very well prepared because she's talked about going over her notes, and I'm sure they are brilliant. She's joining us from the Substance Abuse Resources and Disability Issues Program. She's a professor of community health at the Boonshoff School of Medicine at Wright State University. Jo, are you with us?
I am. Thank you. Thank you, Joanne, and your team for this engaging and enlightening conference. I registered for the conference to learn more about the barriers to knowledge translation and technology transfer, and I never imagined that one of the barriers was me. And like most investigators, I fantasize about the fruits of my research being utilized by VR counselors and VR consumers, but I never thought through how that would happen. I guess I assume that the online tools that we're developing would be so useful and helpful, that people would just jump at the chance to use them. And I've learned at this conference that this translation from my lab to the VR world won't happen automatically. And I'm more of a newbie at this, I think, than some of the other speakers, including Anna. And I really did learn so much. In fact, I have 18 pages of single-space notes, and I won't read them all to you. But I did want to just highlight some things that I learned as somebody really new to thinking about knowledge translation and technology transfer. The first thing is the need to engage stakeholders, thinking about it right from the get-go. I had never actually heard the term integrated knowledge translation before, and it was really good to learn about this, to get information on how to engage stakeholders, as well as identifying the right stakeholders. Dr. Leahy continued talking about stakeholders, and he also outlined, well, what different kinds of stakeholder groups there are. In addition, he talked about conceptualized knowledge translation packages and the concept of a hook, and the hook being the key element in this knowledge translation package. This was all very useful to me as I think about the things we're developing in the lab and then how to get them into the practice by VR counselors and other vendors. As we went on, the practical KT piece that Anna talked about, I also got a real lot out of that, that the emphasis on systematic reviews and randomized control trials might not be as practical as the expert opinions for practical KT strategies. There were lots of great lessons learned in terms of practical KT strategies. I love the idea that consumers and experts are looking forward while researchers like me are looking backward. And I love that concept, and it's really great as I think about future projects. On Wednesday, we looked at environments, formats, and strategies. And we learned a lot about knowledge translation planning templates, as well as technology transfer planning templates. The first talk that we heard was really, really great on the key components of a knowledge translation plan. The evaluation approaches, I do a lot of evaluation, the reach indicators, quality indicators, use indicators, collaboration and capacity building indicators, the partnership evaluation tool, all of these are so important and useful. What makes a good technology transfer plan was so helpful to understand. And I really liked on Wednesday the talk on social media. I never considered actually social media as a platform to launch my the products that we're developing. The idea that there are 1.5 billion users on Facebook every day, that 10 billion messages are sent. The data on Twitter as well as YouTube really encourages me to think about that. And they had some great ideas, the presenters there, about developing social media process as well as developing a Facebook persona. And then today as well, my own thinking about involving policymakers. Why isn't evidence used by policymakers, helping us understand the barriers as well as the facilitators was so helpful for all of us. And then finally, relevance. That relevance is the key to effective communication, that communication's a two-way street. We have to use the same language as policymakers. They have to understand us. And the idea that relevance drives communications. I thought that overall it was a wonderful conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was a really great wrap-up. And I can tell you really, like Anna, really have thought through all these issues and helped us to synthesize what we are still kind of digesting. I think it's been a lot.
It was a lot of material. You're right.
A lot of material. Yeah. So obviously are going to put up the archive for people who want to go back and think through and look at these resources again and all the websites that were posted. So we've had some comments here in chat. I don't see any burning questions. So I think at this point we're at the point where we're going to wrap it up. Joanne, are you ready to take over?
Okay, I sure will.
Okay.
We're not
all.
quite to the top of the hour, but we will, I think after a pretty long day, we're getting ready to close, and this will also bring to a close our third annual online KT conference for NIDLR grantees and other interested people. We really hope that today's sessions, as well as all the sessions this week, have been useful to you and that you'll be able to take what you've learned and apply it to your NIDLR grants or whatever setting you're in. We've really had a lot of information over the 3 days this week, as was just recently described, examining barriers and KT solutions for overcoming barriers to increasing the use of research by those who can benefit. I want to extend a big thank you to our presenters today. I think they're both gone, Catherine Oliver and Joe Lane. A special thanks also to our grantee colleagues who helped guide the discussion, John Stone, Sarah Von Schroeder, Joe Wilson, and Anna Norweg. We also want to thank everyone who brought content and discussion to us on Monday and Wednesday. And of course, thanks to all of you who are online with us. We appreciate all of you for your participation, whether you are able to be here with us for all 3 days or only part of the time depending on your schedules. The conference sessions, as Kathleen just mentioned, have been recorded, and we will have the archives available soon so that you can catch up with anything you missed or that you might like to hear again. And for those who are interested in the CRC CEU credits, you may request a verification of completion form in the brief evaluation. We'll also follow up by email with all registrants to explain how to request the CRC CEUs. Once the conference session closes, you will see a link to the evaluation form. So we would appreciate it if you could hang on for just a few moments after we end so that you can fill out the evaluation right away while things are still fresh in your mind. But before we do end, we also want to thank and acknowledge the support of our funding agency, the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research, and in particular the support of Dr. Pinjai Sedzawad, who is our project officer and NIDLR's KT coordinator. This conference was really a group effort on the part of all the staff at the Center for KTDRR, and I'll thank everyone as a group instead of naming everyone individually. And I also want to extend our appreciation to our great technical advisors at Intisolv working with the Adobe Connect platform. We hope to see you all here about this time next year for the 4th annual KT conference. So have a nice evening and a great weekend. And please look for that evaluation link before you shut down your computer. Thank you.